So, es ist 10 nach 11. Herzlich willkommen zum heutigen Kolloquium-Vortrag. We have an international guest, so we will switch into English today. Welcome to our colloquium lecture. I'm delighted to welcome you all here, especially, of course, our guest, Veronika Pehe from Prague. No long introduction from me. Instead, I would like to introduce our guest very shortly. Veronika studied comparative literature and film studies at the King's College in London from 2007 until 2011. And she also received a PhD in London in cultural history in 2016. And since that, she has conducted a lot of research projects in the Czech Republic, but she has also been awarded a lot of scholarships to conduct research projects abroad, including in Vienna. I've seen Florence in Italy, very nice, and most recently at the Yale University during the last year. And she's a researcher at the Institute for Contemporary History of the Czech Academy of Science, where she leads the research group for historical transformation studies, which seems to be like a partner to our transformation studies department here at the Hannah-Arendt-Institut. Her research is mainly focused on the history of post-socialism and economic transformations in the 1990s, memory and memory politics in film and television and popular culture. And that brings us right into the lecture she will present today. The main focus will be on the construction of a middle class as a specific group of people in the post-reunification period, which Veronika has examined more closely on the basis of TV programs in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And I'm very curious, especially about the sources you could use, because as I already said, I know a lot of people who are researchers in Germany who are looking at television programs as a source for the transformation period as well. But in Germany, however, it's very difficult to get access to the historical footage. So the correct topic of the presentation is television pedagogy, economic transformation, and the building of a middle class imagination in 1990s Czech Republic and Slovakia. We are very much looking forward to your presentation. Just a short question to the to the Zoom participants. Can you hear us all? If not, just let us raise your hands or something like that. Maybe you can all hear us. So, Veronika, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to be able to present my research here because, indeed, as you mentioned, I think we really do have a lot of topics in common between Prague and Dresden, and that was also the idea for the series of talks. So I guess I'll jump right in, and can I try to use the clicker now? Yeah. So.
The other side.
Other side. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, not yet, because
yes.
All right, there we go. Perfect. So here's a still from the program called Let's Learn to Do Business, produced by Czechoslovak television at the very beginning of 1990. So this is just two months or so after the Velvet Revolution of 1989, which brought down the communist regime in Czechoslovakia. And already on this program, economic experts are discussing the free market as a well-established entity. And what's interesting is that this is January 1990. So this is still several months before any legislation is passed in Czechoslovakia, which liberalized the planned economy and which introduced legislation relating to private business. But on television, these experts were already kind of discussing doing business as if it was kind of a well-established thing. So clearly, Czechoslovak television, which at the time was the only broadcaster in the country, took upon itself a kind of didactic role in popularizing experts' voices and rendering market mechanisms intelligible to the broader public and preparing them also for the legislative changes that were to come. So I was quite intrigued by this program because surely it must have got into production very shortly after the Velvet Revolution in November 1989 in order to screen in January. And I delved into the Czech television archive and the Slovak television archive and discovered that there were a whole host of other such similar economic educational programs, which in the first half of the 1990s, so I'm really focusing on the period between 1990 and 1995 mainly in this talk, these programs aimed to explain basic concepts of the free market to audiences. They were produced mostly by the educational department as well as the journalism department of first Czechoslovak television, and then from 1993, the two televisions separated as the country separated, so into Czech television and Slovak television. But even before 1993, some of these programs were produced in the Prague studio and others in the Bratislava studio. So I'm looking at both the Czech and Slovak programs. So what were these programs like? Well, some of them were kind of more literally educational than others. Some were designed as kind of distance learning courses where viewers could write in to television and, for example, purchase accompanying textbooks or computer programs on floppy disks. Such was the idea behind, for instance, this program called simply Accounting. As you can see, they kind of really approach accounting historically, because here we see a professor explaining accounting methods from ancient Egypt. But there were also many kind of practical advices for the contemporary situation. Other programs displayed a kind of, I would say, formal continuity with socialist educational programs with lecture-like formats and the authoritative explicatory monologue of usually a male expert, accompanied also by frequent graphs and illustrations explaining mechanisms such as voucher privatization or how the banking system works in a capitalist economy. A prevalent format, especially in the Slovak case, was also a debate between experts, which was interspersed with reportage sequences, and graphs and tables with economic data were frequent. Other shows came close in their format to what could be called kind of edutainment, incorporating fictional characters, quizzes for the audience, surveys in the streets, or feel-good real-life stories about entrepreneurial success. And a standard assumption of these programs was that audiences did not know the basic principles of the market economy. And so the programs would kind of expose the ignorance of the people and then educate viewers. For example, here, Consumers Club, produced in the Bratislava studio, used this kind of format of a survey in the streets where the camera would walk around and ask people questions like, do you know what rights we have as consumers, or are we sufficiently informed about what is available on the market? And the respondents would invariably say, no idea. And then there would kind of be room for experts to explain to the audience. So I think 2 points can be made here. On the one hand, in their formats, these shows displayed clear continuities with socialist era programming. As media scholar Anniko Imre has written, the educational nature of socialist television programming was very much apparent, and she even called economic programs the least memorable category of education on television. And many of these programs from the 1990s were also kind of quite static, people kind of just talking in the studio, talking heads. There wasn't kind of a lot of action going on. But on the other hand, in their subject matter of convincing audiences to accept the principles of the market economy or the invisible hand of the market, it's also hard perhaps not to think of American economist Milton Friedman and his well-known TV series Free to Choose, which screened on American public television in 1980 and then was rerun in 1990, which also featured a male expert explaining the economy to audiences, even if, in this case, the kind of on-location filming with Friedman traveling to various destinations such as Hong Kong made for much more dynamic viewing than the Czechoslovak television programs. But we can only speculate if, in fact, the creators of the program Marketing for All, which screened on Slovak television, were perhaps directly inspired by Friedman's Free to Choose, because very much like the American program, we see the main protagonist, an economic expert, Dr. Wolf, who I would say even bears a certain physical resemblance to Friedman, as an elderly, bespectacled, white-haired man. And he's there kind of, illustrating the workings of the market to the audience in an actual marketplace. There's a lot of the scenes show him kind of deliberating over the price of an apple or a razor or, some kind of other basic good. So what can we make of all this material? Well, I was intrigued by these programs and set out to think through what it is they were trying to do. and what function they performed within society at the time. And so one of the kind of basic assumptions of this was that the transition to a market economy from a planned economy was a kind of coherent ideological program which needed to be communicated, and television was a really excellent medium to communicate these kinds of ideas to the general public. So what I want to argue is that economic educational programs compounded a notion of individual enterprising behavior as a fundament of not only the economic, but also the cultural transformation that was to take place in Eastern Europe following the collapse of state socialism. And we can see that in the discourse of experts and policymakers in the media of the 1990s, private entrepreneurs were a key category toward which the promises of the transformation project were geared. And implicit, but sometimes also explicit in such reasoning, was the notion that the new entrepreneurial class would also form the basis of a new Western-style middle class. While economic experts saw entrepreneurs as creators of prosperity, propellers of consumption, and the bearers of values of individual responsibility, sociologists at the time also viewed the middle class as the guarantor of the stability of the nascent political and economic system. So what I want to do in this presentation is to examine television as a medium of building this kind of middle-class imagination among the Czech and Slovak public. And I'll focus on the early 1990s to uncover what could be described as a liminal situation where images of the middle class in visual culture were still being formed and negotiated. So my own approach in this presentation is not to give you a kind of clear definition of what is the middle class or what's the working class. I'm more inspired by the sociology of Pierre Bourdieu, and my analysis of cultural production in terms of class does not start from kind of preconceived categories, but rather I focus on the distribution of different types of capital across society or in these representations and the meanings attached to them. And so in this case, in these television programs. And so what I'll do is I have kind of three aims. I want to suggest that these TV programs can be very effectively analyzed as market pedagogy, which is a concept I adapt from the notion of liberal pedagogy as developed by the Polish sociologist Marta Buchholz. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Then I want to look at the spatial aspects of this market pedagogy on television in relation to constructing a middle class. And so here we come to topographies of transformation, right? Because that's what this lecture series is called. And I think this television material really illustrates well how these messages of transformation ideology at the time were formulated differently for audiences in cities and in rural regions. And finally, I'll offer some remarks on the extent to which audiences were receptive to these messages based on some archival materials from Czech and Slovak television. Okay, so first some context. So after 1989, talk of social class was generally deemed an anachronistic relic of the socialist era by many policy and opinion makers in Eastern Europe, but with one exception, the middle class. So the middle class definitely functioned in period discourse, not only as an economic and social category, but also as a kind of cultural goal, a symbol of prosperity to come, a kind of aspiration and a promise of a return to normality. And so this centrality of the middle class in the ideological project of systemic transformation in Eastern Europe has already been quite extensively explored by scholars who have remarked that just as socialist regimes placed the working class at the center of the social contract, the capitalist liberal democracies that were born at the turn of the 1990s in Eastern Europe made a claim to legitimacy through placing the middle class in a hegemonic role. One of the most prominent scholars of post-socialist liberalism, the Polish sociologist Jerzy Śladzki, put it this way, that the myth of the workers was replaced by, I quote, the myth of the entrepreneurs and the middle class. And he further observed that the prevailing ideology of the time, I quote, bestowed a special civilizational mission on the middle class. Now, in most of the television programs discussed, the middle class is not referenced explicitly, but there are various kind of metaphors that, in fact, refer to it. So advanced economies, for instance, functions as a kind of shorthand for Czechoslovak goals. The public sphere also abounded with other metaphors for achieving a kind of Western middle class standard of living, such as a return to Europe, a return to a natural order, or a return to normality. And I'll show some examples in a second how that worked. And just kind of note is that these programs largely did not really address what sociologists at the time discussed as a new middle class of the professions, who roughly corresponded to the socialist era intelligentsia. But rather, these programs were really focused on reinstating the old middle class of kind of business and tradespeople. Yeah, and it's clear from the period sociological research from the 1990s that really it was the entrepreneurial component that was overwhelmingly identified with the emerging middle class, and the extent to which kind of intelligentsia professionals could also be considered part of the middle class was a topic of debate among sociologists at the time. Now, in the Czechoslovak context, I think it cannot be overlooked that the idea of returning to the West or returning to normality, as was an often used metaphor, was also mixed with a kind of nostalgia for a return to an alleged golden age of interwar Czechoslovakia, invoked by many economic experts at the time. And so in some versions, the image of the Czechoslovak interwar First Republic was constructed as a kind of plentiful society of small-scale tradespeople. I just offer a quote from Václav Havel, the president at the time, who said on a radio program in 1990 that he looks forward to the fact that from the 1st of December, small businesses will begin to pass into private hands. So he's referring to the process of small-scale privatization. And what I have long hoped for will happen, namely that towns and villages will be filled and flourish with small, diverse shops with a range of diverse goods, as it used to be. Yeah, so he's kind of referring to this past ideal. Now, we could, of course, remark that this kind of fantasy of petty bourgeois entrepreneurialism was not historically replicable because many of the interwar business people who had provided small-scale trade and services had been either Jewish or German and had either perished in the Second World War or been expelled from Czechoslovakia in its aftermath. But nevertheless, in the kind of period imagination, this idea of returning to this kind of lost age of petty bourgeois entrepreneurialism was very much present. So, in what follows, I'll analyze the kind of educational work that these television programs I mentioned at the beginning perform as market pedagogy. So, in other words, these were educational mechanisms that attempted to instill market-oriented thinking in audiences. And I take the cue for this framing, as I mentioned, from Marta Buchholz's work on liberal pedagogy in Poland. And Buchholz builds on the writings of Jerzy Szacki, who and analyzed the discursive formations of the transformation period that were aimed at turning the Polish population towards an acceptance of liberalism, understood as both a political and economic program. So I've narrowed this down to focus specifically on market pedagogy, because these television programs were focused solely on economics. So I'm kind of leaving the political side of liberalism aside, kind of deliberately at the moment. But I think kind of this framework, which was developed in the Polish context, is also very much applicable to the Czech and Slovak context, because Buchholz really kind of gives a very practical way of understanding what it is that discourse, or in this case, kind of the discourse in television programs, did. And she identifies 4 mechanisms which were used to encourage identification with liberal values in the population. And these include role modeling correct behavior, blaming and shaming post-socialist populations for their cultural traits allegedly incompatible with liberalism, showing the error of allegedly backwards mindsets, norms, and institutions, and what she calls self-discovery, but perhaps could also be referred to as kind of encouraging people to naturalize liberalism, or in the case of these shows, the market, free market principles, as something that kind of everybody naturally agrees with. When applied more narrowly to the question of the acceptance of free market principles, I think it's worth thinking about how such a logic of market pedagogy permeated cultural production aimed at a broad public. And especially the role modeling mechanism, Marta Buchholz writes, presented entrepreneurial cosmopolitans with middle-class values as she writes, most compatible with the new reality. I think that's a motif that can also be observed in Czech and Slovak television production. But that said, I think it's also worth noticing that the existing literature largely focuses precisely on cosmopolitans, so on this idea of a kind of big city urban middle class. And although ethnographic work of the late 1990s and early 2000s also explored kind of small scale and micro entrepreneurial practices in rural settings, I think the normative aspects, so the kind of ideological messages of imagining middle classness in rural and provincial locations under post-socialism still remains unexplored. And these television programs can perhaps help us to kind of delve into that. And I'll have a case study of a kind of program addressed at rural audiences later on. So let me actually start from this last mechanism, kind of naturalizing the market. On the most basic level, the programs encourage this idea of naturalizing market logic as a worldview that people, potentially all people, subscribe to of their own accord. And this was achieved through the program's inclusive message. The idea that anyone could partake in the market economy if only they adopted the correct ways of thinking and appropriate consumer habits. And so I should also remark this idea resonated especially in the Czech part of the federation as opposed to Slovakia, where actually the numbers of private entrepreneurs remained proportionally lower. My colleague Martin Babička has written about Czech voucher privatization and the idea of democratic capitalism, open for all, as being particularly prominent in the pedagogy surrounding voucher privatization. So he elaborates that in the discourse of politicians, economists, and investment fund marketers, but also indeed television, voucher privatization, this was this kind of mechanism of privatization in Czechoslovakia where all citizens could buy kind of shares in state-owned companies, and that way they were privatized. Martin Babička writes about how the marketing of voucher privatization to the public was presented as a return to normality. And so, for instance, in this program called Don't Be Afraid of Vouchers, which was this kind of very much educational program aimed at popularizing this privatization mechanism, the voiceover tells the audience, at first glance, neighboring countries that had not built socialism look different. The personal relationship to property has done its job. The people carried out a counter-revolution. They simply decided to return things to where they belong. The state to its role of arbiter, people to the role of entrepreneurs and landlords, and property into the hands of the people. This process of returning to normality is called reform. So the program is kind of attempting to naturalize normality as an entrepreneurially organized society modeled on Western standards. And the West, of course, is a kind of discursive construct in these shows, because although with the opening of borders, people could already travel to the West, and so it became more of a tangible reality rather than just a kind of imagined other, the West's function in educational television programming was essentially normative and conflated with this idea of normality or natural order. And we can even see this in the visual component of Don't Be Afraid of Vouchers. I don't have a screenshot of that, unfortunately, but for instance, when the voiceover speaks of neighboring countries, the camera shows an image of kind of very nice German or Austrian villages. And actually here we can also observe a kind of difference between the Czech and the Slovak context. Slovak programs were even more explicit in using Austria or images of Austria to convey a sense of a particular vision of a kind of middle of the road consumer culture that Slovakia wanted to achieve. Especially in the case of programs produced in the Bratislava studio, the reference point was always Vienna, a city that's a mere 70 kilometers away from Bratislava, of course, and to which Slovaks could now freely travel. So whenever programs such as Consumers Club presented a problem of the Slovak economy, for instance, the lack of information available to consumers to make informed choices, then scenes of regular consumers in Vienna were shown as a goal towards which Slovakia was to strive. And I confirmed this also in the Slovak television archive, where I found a document with a kind of screenplay or kind of concept for the show, which stated the aim of this journalistic program is to show the position of the consumer in countries with advanced economies and in Slovakia. For comparison, we will use an example from neighboring Austria to show what lies in store for us. So this idea that Slovakia is kind of moving there. But the most frequently used pedagogical trope in these programs was role modeling. So this pertained not only to actual models in Western countries, that the Czechoslovak economy and society were to emulate, but also to particular behaviors that the programs posited as worthy of pursuing. And so here, Bourdieu's notion of cultural capital becomes central, because role modeling rested on demonstrating the kinds of cultural capital, not financial, but cultural capital that would allow viewers to make informed business and consumer choices. And so a good example is the first episode of Consumers Club, the Slovak program. And so this episode is centered very much around the pursuit of a product that embodied a new middle-class lifestyle. The host of the show explains, "My wife has started a vegetarian diet and I have been tasked with buying a grain mill. Now, in order to fulfill his wife's wish, where does he go from Bratislava? Well, of course, he goes to Vienna in order to speak to experts on the market about where to buy the perfect grain mill." And so role modeling was justified by cultural arguments in the show. For instance, in this program, the director of the Slovak Trade Inspection advocated for adopting the Austrian consumer protection system by appealing to a shared history of the Habsburg monarchy that made Slovak and Austrian approaches presumably compatible. Other programs, such as Don't Be Afraid of Accounting or a cookbook for entrepreneurs, were also based primarily on this mechanism of role modeling. Through a central character, they modeled an enterprising individual's journey towards acquiring the necessary knowledge and skills for business activities. But programs were not based just on a single mechanism of market pedagogy, but often they combined several. So the other side of role modeling were the mechanisms of blaming and shaming and showing the error, both present across the sample of the television programs. So they would often take on the form of a kind of lament or appeal that Czechs and Slovaks have not yet acquired necessary enterprising characteristics. In Buchholz's typology, blaming and shaming refers more to supposedly hindering cultural traits. And the analyzed programs also demonstrated that their creators found cultural traits obstructing the quick acquisition of market-oriented behaviors. For instance, in this program, a cookbook for entrepreneurs, the main protagonist, who you see on the right, and then on the left is kind of his entrepreneurial spirit, who's kind of guiding him through the program, the little man in a suit. So the protagonist kind of declares, okay, I want to change my approach to time management. I want to get rid of bad habits. Yeah, so there's this idea that there are all these like bad habits kind of ingrained in the socialist period that he needs to kind of shed in order to become a successful entrepreneur. Slovak programs, I would say, engage more frequently with the trope of showing the error. I don't have a great picture from this program, but I do have this kind of wonderful graphic design, very much a product of its period. Showing the error was more about exposing how institutional conditions were slow to adapt to enterprising modes of functioning. So, for instance, in the first episode of Model E, the advisor to the Slovak government for privatization complained, "One of the biggest obstacles is the large ignorance of people. They often confuse different forms of tax. They don't know what profit is, and so on. The business environment has not really been created yet." So the lack of change in mentality, coupled with allegedly low institutional support for implementing business ideas, was a frequent point of critique on Slovak television programs, likely also stemming from the slower development of private business in Slovakia than in the Czech part of the federation. So what these programs bemoaned was not necessarily the lack of different forms of capital that would allow individuals to enter the entrepreneurial classes, but rather structural obstacles preventing people from putting their capital to good use. Okay, now I'm coming to my example of this kind of urban versus rural divide in these programs. So the Polish cultural scholar Magda Szczesniak has discussed how images of the middle class in Polish visual culture of the transformation were weak. Now, what she means by this is that compared to the coherent heroes of socialist realism, images of the protagonists of the 1990s capitalist transformation were often weak in technical terms. You know, films and television programs had poor visual quality, or the editing or layout of magazines was kind of not very well managed, and so on. And often the heroes were also embedded in weak and inconsistent plot lines. And I want to extend this argument to suggest that in the Czechoslovak case, they were not just weak, but also unstable, especially in this kind of early period, let's say from 1990 to about 1993, which is not surprising because this early transformation era was marked, of course, by quite a volatile movement of people from one social class to another and kind of changing social roles. Private business enabled certain individuals to get rich very quickly, while highly skilled professionals could lose their jobs and become unemployed and so on. And so early programs displayed a lot of uncertainty about who actually constitutes the entrepreneurial class and what types of capital are necessary for joining it. So a recipe book for the business-minded is my example here. This was a very popular program, which began screening in November 1991, at a time when who could take up the role of the entrepreneur was still relatively open. So this program was composed of a series of interviews with budding entrepreneurs in the studio, interspersed with short reportage sequences from various regions of the country. And the program was in fact an extension of a successful show called A Recipe Book Not Only for Sunday, which was a program for DIY home improvers and gardeners, hosted by the same host, Člověk Podlaha, and had screened already from 1988. And then from 1991, these two recipe book programs broadcast alternately on a bi-weekly schedule. Now, although you might think, well, how are these home improvers related to entrepreneurs? In fact, scholars have remarked that the practices of bricolage of the improvers movement under socialism were in fact a kind of breeding ground for small-scale business in late socialism, with people being able to sell their products or their inventions, sometimes legally based on permits, or more often also illegally on the black market. Now, other visual media of the period really accentuated, this idea of business people as kind of big city, urban, Western style, middle class, right? And kind of they centered their pedagogy around this kind of role modeling aspect. And the recipe book for the business-minded, to an extent, also engaged with this kind of image of a hardworking entrepreneur successfully entering the middle class. So in the first episode, Bohumila Briová, a well-presented middle-aged woman, appeared on the program to talk about her expanding business of shops and small-scale production, and she described her hard-working lifestyle with little sleep and endless journeys to manage her growing business emporium, and she complained about the envy of her neighbors who punctured her car tires because she's becoming such a successful businesswoman. Now, if for Bourdieu, cultural capital consisted mainly of possessing the correct language and behavior, Magda Szcześniak remarks how visual capital, or kind of looking the part, was essential to entry into the new middle classes in the early 1990s, in a situation where cultural capital acquired through education or family may actually have been lacking. And so Bohumila Briová definitely embodied this kind of new model. Her membership in the new entrepreneurial class is expressed through attributes of status distinction, such as her cultural appearance or the possession of a new car. But on the other hand, now my clicker, okay, there we go. The program also showcased the entrepreneurial endeavors of Antonín Opat, a hop grower who invented a new instrument, a special fork to facilitate hop growing. And Opat, as opposed to Briová, had not yet, and possibly did not at all, aspire to acquiring the habitus of the entrepreneur. His speech was slurred and peppered with slang and vulgarisms while on television, and he even called the instruments he invented "those fuckers" on TV. So this example is not presented here to shame Opat's working class mode of presentation in any way, but to showcase this kind of instability of the entrepreneurial identity in the early 1990s, when television really presented, this opportunity to anyone to be able to join this kind of class of small business people. So at this point, this program did not really engage yet in what Buchholz identifies as blaming and shaming of social vices, presumably hindering the adoption of a liberal mindset. So my point is that, in 1991, this repertoire of portrayals was still kind of relatively open enough for negotiation, even if television programs did also criticize prevailing socialist mindsets as obstacles to effective market reform. And so this program, A Recipe Book for the Business-Minded, included diverse examples such as fish farming, small breweries, the business activities of a miner, village shops, a pub in a converted garage, ski lifts, beauty salons. It showcased many enterprising individuals from rural settings and small towns, where at least visually, these budding entrepreneurs did not necessarily conform to the models of the new business class presented in urban-centered media, such as the magazine Success that I showed earlier. And what we know from archival materials stored in Czech television is that this program, along with the Sunday recipe book, the other recipe book program, was eagerly watched in the countryside, and many viewers from the countryside sent letters to Czech television to say how much they loved the program. So, it becomes clear that cultivating a kind of small town and rural middle class seemed to form an important element of this show's transformational pedagogy. And we could perhaps even say kind of romanticize the lemonade stand variety of grassroots capitalism that critics also accused Milton Friedman's theories of privileging, while ignoring the role of big business and industrial corporations in contemporary capitalism. And in the Czech case, the importance of this model of the interwar First Republic that I already discussed was emphasized. Also in Don't Be Afraid of Vouchers, the program I already mentioned, where the annotation of the first episode states that the series introduces viewers to basic economic terms, names the reasons for the economic prosperity of the First Republic and the reasons for the collapse of the socialist economy. And Slovak programming also confirmed this kind of vision of small town entrepreneurialism, for instance, on the show Credit, which criticized the high rents of commercial premises in Bratislava that were allegedly hindering the development of a successful private sector. And at the same time, the program emphasized the model example of a much smaller town of Dunajská Streda, where, according to the program, the municipality had set up favorable rental conditions, and as a result, this kind of small petty trade was thriving. And even experts at the time believed that television programs such as A Recipe Book for the Business-Minded could actually contribute to the development of small-scale business in rural regions. I found a remarkable letter in the Czech television archive, which the host of the show, Przemek Podlaha, forwarded even to the Director General of Czech television. The letter was written by sociologist Stanislav Hubík from Palacký University in Olomouc, and the letter details how this program became the subject of a discussion at an academic seminar in Salamanca on developmental strategies of rural areas organized by the UNESCO Institute of Education. And so the sociologist who was writing the Czech television claimed that the educational service the show provided for rural viewers was actually viewed very favorably by seminar participants in Salamanca as a kind of model worth emulating. And in a later published paper, Hubík interpreted the Recipe Book enterprise as a kind of alternative and postmodern educational institution that puts into effect, I quote, the communicative transformation of cultural values into economic values. So the analysis of this particular sociologist, I think, points to how the building of an entrepreneurial middle class via visual media mobilized different resources if aimed at urban and rural viewers, right? We saw those magazine covers kind of aimed at the big city people, and now we have, people from villages with kind of, their hop growing improvements and so on. And so I would say this is because the recipe books encourage viewers to harness the kind of informal cultural capital of bricolage, or in other words, creatively making use of resources at hand in ways not learned through formal education. And such appeals were drawing perhaps on different imaginative repertoires than the Western-oriented images of entrepreneurialism aimed at big city dwellers. This program encouraged viewers to turn vernacular forms of knowledge into potentially profitable enterprises. And I would say this differentiated the program from other shows of the period, which attempted more to kind of mediate expert knowledge. And I think we can posit as letters from viewers, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, indicate that audiences were really ready to identify with this vernacularization of entrepreneurial efforts as something that anyone with a kind of creative idea can engage in, as opposed to more traditional educational programs, which, despite attempts at some more innovative formats, were generally, quite static with kind of experts talking in the studio. And those other programs, as also the statistics, the kind of audience statistics from the period show, were not as nearly as popular as this program, as the recipe books. I'll try to kind of just to move towards the audience reception and to wrap up this talk slowly. What I think made this particular program so attractive to audiences was that it also didn't require the kind of visual capital of big city business or visible markers of status distinction for people to become entrepreneurs, or that was the kind of message it was conveying.
But what did he actually do with this youngster?
Yeah, so these sticks were somehow used to, so when you grow hops, to produce beer, hops grow, they're kind of plant that grows usually on these kind of wooden poles, and you have to somehow attach the plant to the wooden poles. They're quite high, and this somehow kind of facilitated, I guess, then like taking the plant down and harvesting it.
Okay.
Yeah, he shows it on the show. So these observations about kind of why the show was popular are largely confirmed by an analysis of the available data on the reception of these programs based on letters from the audience. And now, of course, a methodological caveat is letters from the audience are not representative, a representative source in the sense that only very particular viewers go, to the effort of writing into television. But what the letters that are archived demonstrate is that those particular viewers who did choose to write to Czech and Slovak television turned to television as a trusted institution. And I kind of want to make this point because it might seem counterintuitive, right? In a country where the reputation of state television had been compromised in the socialist period by strict political control and censorship. But I would also say that in Czechoslovakia, television gained a special kind of revolutionary legitimacy through its active participation in overthrowing the communist regime in November and December 1989, compounded also by the clearly pro-democratic and pro-market line it took immediately after the regime change. And so in the situation of regime change, this relationship of trust manifested primarily in viewers expecting guidance on their way to normality, or you can substitute any of the other metaphors discussed. So programs that provided learning materials, such as accounting, received literally hundreds of requests every week for textbooks and materials to be sent to them. In the final episode of Accounting, a guest from the Union of Accountants noted that they received over 3,000 letters, many of which were calls for help, as he put it on the program. And the host of the show added in the same episode that he was even often stopped by people in the street who were asking for assistance with their accounting. So it's clear that people really were turning to television kind of with calls for help, right? In this kind of situation where legislation was changing very dynamically, they were kind of trying to orient themselves on the market, and television was one of those institutions that could provide guidance. But what this means is that television also sat somewhat uncomfortably as an institution between two positions of, on the one hand, conveying in the content of its programming the period dictum that it's the own responsibility of citizens to change their ways of thinking and to adapt to the demands of market economy and become these kind of individual self-reliant subjects. But on the other hand, producers were also aware that television was in this special position to be able to guide viewers along the way, to offer a kind of helping hand. And in fact, this dilemma was laid out in the first episode of Let's Learn to Do Business, so the very first image I showed you in January 1990. Because although the pedagogy of appeals for taking up enterprising attitudes was open to all, interlocutors on TV programs also voiced their reservations and talked about obstacles. So in Let's Learn to Do Business, a certain hesitancy about the ability to take up new modes of thinking was formulated by a manager in a large construction enterprise. And I'll just quote what he says on that program. So he kind of complains, I mean, this is a kind of, direct translation, but what he's saying is, under socialism, we got a kind of task within the plan, within the planned economy, and no one cared how much it would cost. We would just have to do it. And then he says, I think we're going to have to reverse that kind of thinking. Yeah, so he's aware that probably won't work in market conditions anymore. We who work on these building sites feel that we are the bearers of this task, and we have to start, but someone has to help us, right? And so, I don't have the image, but when you watch the show, he sounds a bit desperate and confused. He's kind of like, how are we going to do this? So he's really appealing for help in the particular case of adapting towards a more cost-effective mode of functioning. But I think it's also possible to draw a parallel with viewers who appeal to television for help in finding their bearings in a market environment. And I think particularly ambivalent is actually the role of TV presenters, who often stood clearly on the side of entrepreneurs against the state. Yeah. So Przemek Podlaha, who hosted those recipe books, often he would kind of say, I'm with you, I'm with the small people, and the state isn't helping you. All these new regulations are kind of difficult to find your way in, and I empathize with you, the people who are trying to do business. And there was a Slovak presenter called Iveta Ištoková who kind of did something similar. I don't have an unfortunately good image of her, it's kind of difficult to get the images from the archives. You know, you were asking about the availability of the materials, so it's easy to watch them, but you're not really supposed to take photos and so on. So that makes it a bit more difficult to present. But Ištokova ran a show called Accent, where she would invite guests, and there would be these kind of situations where she'd be kind of advocating for more state intervention. In the situation where everybody's talking about, liberalizing the market, while her guests, such as this gentleman from the Ministry of the Economy of Slovakia, was kind of saying, well, it's not the business of the state to guide businesses. Businesses are just kind of out there on their own, and she's kind of there opposing him. So, presenters also had this kind of ambivalent role in these messages. And I would say that the Ištokova stance, so the Slovak presenter stance, was consistent with the overall message of Slovak educational programming that placed emphasis on the role of institutions in creating adequate conditions for business. While in comparison, Czech programs appeared to engage actually more with this myth of the hardworking individual entrepreneur who would succeed on the strength of their ideas. But nevertheless, I would say that neither Czech nor Slovak programs, even in their emphasis on small-scale trade, did not embrace the invisible hand of the market, to use a kind of well-known metaphor, as emphatically as Milton Friedman's program, Free to Choose. So now I'll conclude. I argued that post-socialist television programs from the early 1990s reveal the extent to which hopes for building a free market economy and with it a prospering and by implication middle-class society were very much based on the idea of cultivating small-scale enterprise and trade. These educational programs naturalize private enterprise as the organizing principle of society, but the pedagogical work these programs performed was not aimed only at urban cosmopolitans emulating Western-style models, but a lot of attention was also devoted to presenting a kind of television pedagogy for entrepreneurially minded populations in the countryside, as I illustrated on the example of a recipe book for the business-minded. And as letters from the audiences show, viewers were really quite receptive to this particular vision of small-town entrepreneurialism without a capital-intensive entry threshold. So overall, I guess my final point that I want to make is that I think this research draws our attention to the need for more socio-spatial analysis in the role of media in this transformation period, in cultivating a small town and rural middle class, which I argue constituted an important element of Czechoslovak transformational pedagogy. And while we do have anthropological studies of post-socialism that have paid attention to rural and marginalized groups during economic transformation, I think on the level of the discursive messages addressed to these groups, there's still a lot of research to be done. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.